In the pantheon of Bloodborne's bosses, Dark Beast Parl is in a class by itself. That's because, unlike other bosses, Parl is dead. In the enclosure between Old Yharnam and Yahar Ghul, Parl's body lies motionless, partially submerged in the soil. Just like an old corpse, it has no flesh, no eyes, and no blood. But as we approach this pile of bones and fur, some sort of strange electricity suddenly brings Parl back to life.
It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
If Parl's electricity-induced resurrection brings to mind Frankenstein, that's probably by design. It's generally understood that Bloodborne leans heavily on the giants of Gothic horror. If you followed my channel, you know I've argued that Bloodborne borrowed liberally from The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with its central theme of transformation brought about by the abuse of medicinal agents. In a similar vein, the invigorating sparks that reanimate the carcass of Dark Beast Parl at first seem to be a wink at Mary Shelley's classic of Victorian horror. But there's more than just a literary homage at play here. As we'll see in this episode of Bite-Sized Bloodborne, just like Dr. Victor Frankenstein and his monster, Parl and the so-called Spark Hunters appear to be inspired by the shocking, real-life biological and medical experiments of the 17 and 1800s. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published in 1818 and centers on the protagonist Dr. Victor Frankenstein, a man who was enthralled by alchemy and the burgeoning natural sciences around the turn of the 19th century. The doctor's fascination with what we might today call electrochemistry leads him on a quest to create life by his own hands, specifically to imbue life into inanimate, albeit organic matter. In order to create what would become known as Frankenstein's monster, the doctor gathers raw materials in a rather unseemly manner. As Shelley writes, these materials were the bones collected from the charnel houses and masses of dead flesh from the dissecting room. The early 1800s was the height of anatomical dissection, after all. Shelley's language in the original story is rather vague when it comes to the process by which Frankenstein's monster turns from a pile of dead flesh and bone into a living creature. But one line from the novel stands out. Describing the moment the monster comes to life, our narrator, Dr. Frankenstein, recounts, "With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet." Countless adaptations of the story would treat the moment of reanimation as a frenetic scene of lightning strikes and flying sparks that powered metallic contraptions that seem far ahead of their time. But scholars of Victorian literature and of the history of science have almost universally acknowledged that what inspired Shelley's character, Dr. Frankenstein, and his experiments using electricity on the dead was the real-life scientific study known as Galvanism. Galvanism emerged as a field of study in the late 18th century thanks largely to the work of Italian researcher Luigi Galvani, a medical doctor who focused on comparative anatomy. Galvani, who obtained an electrostatic machine in the 1770s, introduced it into his anatomical experiments and observed that the severed legs of dead frogs could twitch and spasm when exposed to an electric current. Galvani and many of his European contemporaries were inspired by the Renaissance-era theory of irritability, essentially that organic tissues respond to all manner of stimuli, be it kinetic, chemical, or other. These Enlightenment-era thinkers presumed that there was a sort of life force or spirit of the nerves that could be stimulated by electricity. This hypothetical force was known as animal electricity. If this force was truly the source of all life, these researchers thought, then perhaps electricity could be harnessed to heal all manner of ailments and, on a much grander scale, to revive the dead. While Galvani's experiments in the 1780s primarily involved electrically stimulating the severed legs of frogs, later experiments on the severed heads and limbs of mammals paved the way for galvanism to make the jump to human subjects, sometimes to horrifying effect. In January of 1803, Galvani's nephew and fellow scientist Giovanni Aldini obtained the body of convicted killer George Forster, whose corpse was brought straight from the gallows to the Royal College of Surgeons of London to be dissected and experimented on for medical study. Aldini was on a European tour and had come to London at the request of the Royal Humane Society to determine whether galvanism could be used to successfully revive sufferers of asphyxiation, primarily drowning victims. Forster, who had been hanged just an hour earlier, was to be the test subject. Using a galvanic battery of copper and zinc plates, Aldini applied a rod to Forster's head, causing the jaw to quiver and his facial muscles to contort. His left eye even suddenly opened. According to Aldini's notes, additional shocks prompted Forster's body to convulse, almost to give an appearance of reanimation. In the end, galvanism couldn't revive Forster, proving the limits of this promising line of study. It's often asserted that Aldini and his experiments with galvanism in London served as the main inspiration for Dr. Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's eponymous novel. A popular theory is that English surgeon Anthony Carlisle, who was in attendance for Aldini's galvanism experiment, must have shared his first-hand account of the event during an 1803 dinner party hosted by William Godwin, Mary Shelley's father. Shelley would have only been 5 years old at the time, but perhaps she heard the story from her father in later years. A more likely theory is that Shelley's husband, Percy Shelley, stoked her interest in galvanism, as he himself was fascinated by the subject, had lightly dabbled with it while a student at Oxford, and remained an avid reader of books on the potential of reanimation. Continued study of electrophysiology by physicians of the early 1800s, including that of Scottish scientist Andrew Urey, would stoke public fears about resurrecting the dead. But the fruits of this work ultimately would save many lives. By the mid-1800s, surgeons in England and Scotland came to rely on electric shock in cases when a patient's heart or respiration stopped as the result of overexposure to ether and chloroform anesthesia. Much like modern-day doctors use a defibrillator to shock the heart back into action, surgeons in the 19th century would zap patients using a galvanic battery that in many cases would restore normal breathing and heartbeat. In my series, An Agony of Effort, The True Story of Bloodborne, I argued that Bloodborne is a massive allegory for the horrific, often blood-soaked medical research of the 17 and 1800s. The dissection of cadavers plays a central role in this extensive medical metaphor, and From Software uses hunters as a parallel for anatomists of the Georgian and Victorian eras, whereas beasts serve as a parallel for medical patients and, much more commonly, cadavers. We see that relationship play out yet again with the Spark Hunters and with Dark Beast Parl. According to the Spark Hunter badge, the Spark Hunters, led by Archibald, were fascinated with the blue sparks that emanate from the hides of the Dark Beasts. The notion is that these beasts possess some sort of inherent spark, just like the innate animal electricity that Galvani and his contemporaries theorized. The Spark Hunter Archibald dedicated his life to recreating these blue sparks of beasts, just like Galvani, Aldini, and Urey did with galvanism, applying electricity to dead bodies, in the hopes of healing or reanimating them. Parl, this dead beast that returns to life with the power of these blue arcing sparks, appears to be a metaphorical representation of the cadaver returned to life with the power of electricity. If Parl depicts a corpse reanimated by electricity, what about the Spark Hunters? Who were they? Simple. Because hunters are analogs for the surgeons and anatomists of the 17 and 1800s who carved up cadavers for research, the Spark Hunters are depictions of the real-life medical and biological researchers we just talked about who used galvanism to experiment on cadavers. In Bloodborne, the Spark Hunters are characterized as eccentric figures or heretics whose practices ran counter to those of the healing church hunters. To say that the real-life scholars of galvanism were eccentric figures whose experiments were seen as a rebuke of the natural order would be a gross understatement. Although we receive little information about the Spark Hunters, we know they touted their own unique gadgets, primarily the Tonitrus trick weapon and the tiny Tonitrus hunter tool. One look at a galvanic battery and almost any dramatic reinterpretations of galvanism in popular culture gives us a strong indication where From Software drew inspiration for these items. Before we close up this episode, have you ever wondered where the name Parl came from? I wish I had a definitive answer, but instead I just have an interesting possibility. Some players have noted that Parl is a city in South Africa whose name is derived from the Dutch word Paarl, which means pearl. I think they might be on the right track with South Africa, but I don't think the pearl connotation is the inspirational spark we're after. Parl, South Africa is the seat of the municipal area known as Frankenstein. Could this be a subtle hint connecting Parl and Frankenstein? We'll have to brainstorm on that. Thanks for watching.